Hello, everyone, to another session of V2T Expert Panel. My name is Victor Monga. I am VCN TAM for VMware. Today, I have an expert, Jennifer Schmidt. Jennifer?
Hi, everyone. I'm Jen Schmidt. I'm a VCN TAM here, work with Victor, and we're going to talk about migrating across vCenter environment today.
Jen, last time we talked about a couple of options, and one of them was in-place migration using Migration Coordinator. So why don't we start V2T migration option with that one? Give us details about how a customer can do in-place migration using NSX Migration Coordinator.
Sure. So if anybody doesn't really know, just real quick, I want to just talk about the in-place migration coordinator. It is a built-in tool within NSXT Manager. It is an automated process for migrating your NSX for vSphere data center over to NSXT. One of the neat features about it as well is you can install the NSXT Manager into an environment, and you can kind of run through some of the pre-checks that we have and kind of use it as an assessment tool to see if your environment is even eligible to use the migration coordinator.
And as always, what are the gotchas? What is not supported in a migration coordinator? Let's talk about that as well.
So obviously, for this discussion, one of the main things that has not been supported completely is the migration of the NSX cross vCenter environment. I know a lot of customers use that in their NSX for vSphere for disaster recovery and some other options. So up until NSX 3.1.1, we now have a hybrid way of kind of migrating your cross vCenter environment. So as you can see here, a supported feature in NSXT 3.1.1, we're now able to migrate universal objects from universal objects to local objects in NSXT. The only gotcha really here is that it's still only supported for a single NSX manager. So that means that we can't have a secondary NSX manager enabled, and we can still have the primary. So if you were really just using your cross vCenter environment, say just for disaster recovery, and that secondary site was sitting dormant, you could go ahead and delete that secondary NSX manager, leave your primary manager up with its universal objects, and then migrate it over to one NSXT instance. So in this case here, we have, so there's different topologies that you can use for the migration coordinator. And today we're going to talk about this topology number 3. I just wanted to give you an overlook of what that topology is going to look like, because we do have a demo on it a little later on. But here I have NSX for vSphere environment with a manager in primary mode, no secondary NSX for vSphere manager. And we'll be migrating with the same data center, in the same data center from V to T. So we have the edges that will get migrated here. We have 2 edges in ECMP, and they'll get migrated over to an active T0. We have the edge services gateway in an HA, and that will get migrated over to the T1 SR. And then we have the universal distributed logical router, which will just become the DR portion of the T1 gateway. So after those edges are migrated, we'll migrate the hosts from NSXV to NSXT. And then that's when you'll see here the gateways and the workloads are moved over to this T1 DR.
And that's a lot of good information. And I think knowing me, I would forget it right after this call. Is there a checklist that we can give to our customers that really helps with the migration steps and stages of what we need to do?
Sure. Yeah. So the main stages of the migration coordinator are the 4 stages you see here. So we have our prereqs, which we want to make sure, in our migration coordinator guide, you'll see kind of a list of the prereqs that are necessary. You need to make sure that your NSXV version is at 6.4.4 or later. You need to be at the correct NSXT version. Your hosts all have to be stable. All environments really need to be stable for this to happen. And then after that, we have a pre-migration configuration, which kind of goes through in itself in the tool, a checklist of items that may or may not be migrated or things that need to be fixed before you can move on to the migration. And then once that process is completed, then we simply migrate the edges. And then after that come the host migration, and then you're done. Okay, so here we have a demo of that topology number 3 that we spoke about a few slides ago. So here you'll see that I have NSX for vSphere setup. I've got a primary manager in NSXV with no secondary manager in the picture anymore. So we'll move over to the logical switches, and you'll see here that we've got the universal logical switches. We have the UDLR Edge Transit Universal Logical Switch, and then the switches for the 3-tier apps. And here in the edges page, you'll see that we have those 2 edges in ECMP mode with the NSX Edge Load Balancer, and then that Universal Distributed Logical Router. So if we go to the interfaces of the UDLR, you'll see that we have those universal logical switches connected to this UDLR, and these will be migrated over to T as local objects. Along with the networking setup, we also have a universal distributed firewall with universal security groups that are made of just IP addresses. And those will also be migrated over as local objects. So if I go here to this VIP page, you'll just see that my 3-tier app is currently working. So once we go over to NSXT, start the migration coordinator, we'll go ahead and enter our credentials and then start the import configuration. Once that's all complete, you'll see here in the migrate config, we have some issues to resolve. So you'll see here that we have our universal objects are present. These will be migrated as local objects. So we're just going to go ahead and accept that, acknowledge that, and move on to the next. So I'm not going to go through all of these categories here. I just wanted to show you some of these universal objects that we have. And then also in the warnings, you'll see that our NSXV transport zones, the 2 different local and universal transport zones, will be migrated into a single overlay transport zone. So once that's done, we can move on to the migrate configuration. Here's where that the lift of the configuration that we imported will be placed into NSXT. Once that's complete, we'll go ahead and migrate our NSX edges. So once the edges are migrated, what's going to happen is our NSX for V workloads will still be on the VVibs of the host, and then they'll migrate out of the environment using the NSXT edges. After the edges, we have the host migration. So here in our compute cluster, we're going to migrate our hosts. And this is where the VVibs are uninstalled and the TVibs are installed, and then the workloads are moved to the new NSXT segments. You have the option of changing the migration mode. You can do a maintenance mode, which is an auto maintenance mode or manual maintenance mode, which will move around your workloads and put the host into maintenance mode. In this case, I went with the in-place mode. It was going to be a little quicker, and we'll be able to keep the VMs and everything on the host while we do that upgrade. So once the host configuration is done, or the host migration rather is done, we can go ahead and finish the migration. Now we'll go ahead and look at our environment, and also you'll see here that we'll go back to the VIP, and you'll see that our 3-tier app is still working after the whole migration has taken place. So if we go to Fabric and Nodes, you'll see here that our NSX edges and compute cluster have successfully been migrated to NSXT. We have our T0 gateway. We have that in active mode like our ESGs were. We've got BGP running and enabled. And then here you'll see our interfaces have been moved over. And these were all our external uplinks to the physical network. Next, I'll show the segments that have been moved over. So anything that's been moved over from NSX for vSphere gets this -ls tagged on to the segment name. And here you'll see our universal logical switches have been migrated to NSXT segments, and with that combined transport zone name. And then these segments here are connected to the T1, which is uplinked to the T0 gateway. We also have our distributed firewall rules that were moved over. So we have our universal distributed firewall section. And then we've got our local groups that have been comprised of the IP addresses that we saw in our NSX for vSphere environment. And that's the end of the demo.
So Jen, now that we have seen the demo, we talked about the in-place migration code using NSX Migration Coordinator. In the previous session, we also talked about another option called lift and shift. So why don't you give us a little bit details about what is that option? How does our customers can leverage it?
Sure. So the lift and shift method is really just kind of like a coexist where we have NSX for vSphere stood up, and then you can stand up a new greenfield NSXT deployment kind of side by side. This is where, we're going to have the most options and flexibility. So if the migration coordinator is not going to work for you, this is really the step that we're going to have to take as long as you have the additional hardware to do this. So in this case, the management and the edge resources could possibly be shared if you didn't stand up a whole new vCenter with new hosts in it. And then here you have different ways that you can configure your environment, configure your workload to migrate. There's a lot of design flexibility. You don't have to stick with the same design that you have in NSX for V. You can kind of, maybe clean up your design or go a different direction in your NSXT environment, and then move your workloads and resources over as you migrate slowly to NSXT. So to migrate from an NSX for vSphere cross vCenter environment over to an NSXT environment, and you want to keep that same kind of architecture, we have two different options that you can kind of architect into. You can architect into an NSXT multi-site environment, which means you can manage all of your sites from one NSX manager cluster. And this would be kind of for a disaster recovery use case or an active use case. And then we have what's called Nsxt Federation. This allows you to manage multiple sites within a single pane of glass. So here we have global managers oversee a bunch of local NSX managers, and those global managers help sync information across the sites. So those are your two options if you wanted to kind of keep the same design. So I'm going to kind of talk about just a disaster recovery example here. So here we've got an NSX for vSphere environment that's used for disaster recovery. You see we have primary and secondary NSX managers. We have a universal distributed logical router stretched across these two sites. And also the universal logical switches are stretched across the sites along with the firewall rules. So this would be kind of like your typical NSX for vSphere environment. So now let's say we wanted to move that to an NSXT environment for disaster recovery. We would stand up a brand new greenfield environment. We can either use the same vCenter or a different vCenter. We just have to make sure that the hosts are not in the same cluster for your workloads. Any of your compute hosts will have to be in a separate cluster from the NSXV hosts. Here we have the T0 and T1 routers that are sitting in a active standby scenario. You can also do an active if you wanted to. And then you have the option to stretch your segments across the data center. This is basically more of a configuration option that you have in how you architect your environment. And then you would have standard DFW rules, and those would apply at both sites for any workload that you actually pulled into that NSX manager. There are many different ways to address how the failover process in this situation would work in a multi-site environment. You can use layer 2 bridging to migrate workloads, and or you can do some kind of manual migration if you're standing this up side by side. So the most important piece about how you're going to migrate from your NSX V to T environment really is your workload and policy migration. You have the option of using NSXT bridging. So here you would create an NSXT edge node, place it on an NSXV prepared host, move the gateway over to NSXT, and then you can move the workloads over from NSXV to the T segments. And then we also have the option to use HCX. In this scenario, you would have to have two separate vCenters, and then you'd also have to have the HCX manager the HCX interconnect appliance and the network extensions in order to move from the universal logical switch over to the segment. This will move your gateway over as well, but both of these scenarios will require that all of your policies get moved over to NSXT before the migration happens. Otherwise, if you move your workloads over to the T environment, they'll be unprotected if you have certain NSX security policies in place. And that's all I have for you today.
Thanks so much, Jen. As always, stay tuned for more sessions from V2T expert panel. And if you have any feedback for us, please go ahead and submit it. Thank you.
Thank you.